In the unpredictable world of fantasy football, few players can turn a game on its head the way Kansas City Chiefs quarterback Patrick Mahomes can. Week 7 of the NFL season was no exception, as Mahomes showcased his undeniable talent with a performance that left both fans and fantasy football managers in. After a few weeks of ups and downs, Mahomes delivered another stellar outing, reminding everyone why he is considered one of the elite quarterbacks in both real football and fantasy football. The game itself was a spectacle, a true reflection of Mahomes' game-breaking potential. Mahomes completed over 70% of his passes for more than 300 yards, threading the needle on several high-difficulty throws. Not only did he display his usual precision, but Mahomes also demonstrated his dual-threat capabilities with a rushing touchdown that showcased his athleticism and ability to make plays with his legs when necessary. His ability to create magic on the field when plays break down is a crucial part of his fantasy value, and Sunday's game highlighted that fact perfectly. Fantasy managers who started him were rewarded handsomely, as Mahomes finished with over 30 fantasy points, providing a solid return on investment for those who trusted him as their quarterback. For fantasy football owners, it's been a season of highs and lows. Mahomes, coming into the season as one of the top quarterbacks in all of fantasy football, had a few weeks that caused some worry. His performances didn't always live up to expectations, leaving some fantasy managers questioning whether he could still be relied upon for consistent, high-level performances. But Week 7 proved that those concerns were short-lived. Mahomes' performance is a great example of why patience is so important in fantasy football. Even though some may have been tempted to bench him after a few lackluster weeks, his true potential is always just one game away from resurfacing. Now, with his recent showing, he is once again firmly entrenched in the conversation for top fantasy quarterback of the season. For managers who stuck with him through his down weeks, Week 7 provided the type of reward they were hoping for. The fantasy football landscape is always in flux, while Mahomes' return to form is certainly a headline-grabbing story. Week 7 also featured a number of other performances that stood out for better or for worse. However, none of them were quite as dramatic as Mahomes' return to glory. When Mahomes performs at his best, fantasy managers can't help but feel the effects of his stellar outings. His ability to throw the ball deep downfield, his chemistry with star receivers like Tyreek Hill and Travis Kelce, and his tendency to create magic when the pocket collapses all contribute to his elite status in fantasy football. As the season moves forward, Mahomes' fantasy managers will need to continue relying on him as the cornerstone of their teams. His schedule moving forward also looks favorable, which could mean more high-point games ahead. For fantasy players looking to make a playoff push, Mahomes is a key asset, one that can turn the tide in matchups against tough opponents. The Chiefs' offensive scheme, coupled with Mahomes' improvisational skills, makes him one of the most valuable players in fantasy football, especially during the second half of the season when matchups begin to matter more than ever. The big question for fantasy football managers now is whether Mahomes will continue his hot streak. Based on his performance in Week 7, there's little doubt that he'll remain one of the most consistent quarterbacks in fantasy football. But as we've seen before, anything can happen in the NFL. Mahomes is certainly not immune to the occasional off week, but his ceiling is higher than that of almost any other quarterback in the league. In Week 7, Mahomes showed why he's worth starting every single week. Beyond just Mahomes, Week 7 also served as a reminder of how the booms and busts of fantasy football can change on a dime. Some players who were expected to perform well fell short, while others, who had been underperforming, suddenly turned in spectacular performances. Week 7 wasn't just about Mahomes, it was also about the unpredictability that makes fantasy football such an exciting game. While Mahomes was a clear boom this week, there were plenty of other stories to follow. For instance, several quarterbacks struggled in Week 7, causing their fantasy managers to panic. Players like Dak Prescott and Russell Wilson, who had been performing well earlier in the season, posted underwhelming numbers. In contrast, others like Joe Burrow and Jalen Hurts came through with big performances that helped fantasy managers win their matchups. This week's action illustrated the volatility of fantasy football. One week, a player can be a fantasy hero. The next, they're a bust. The idea of booms and busts is something that every fantasy football manager is familiar with. A boom week happens when a player exceeds expectations and their fantasy performance drastically outperforms their projected points. A bust, on the other hand, is when a player fails to meet expectations or completely underperforms relative to their potential. For Mahomes, Week 7 was an undeniable boom. His performance not only re-established his status as a top-tier fantasy quarterback, but also provided much-needed points to his fantasy managers who were riding high on his success. While Mahomes owners were enjoying their week, some fantasy players faced the harsh reality of bust performances. Whether it was a running back fumbling at the wrong time, a wide receiver dropping passes, or a quarterback throwing interceptions at inopportune moments, Week 7 was a reminder of how quickly fortunes can change in fantasy football. It's this unpredictability that makes the game so much fun and also so stressful. Managers are constantly chasing the next boom, while trying to avoid the crushing disappointment of a bust. In the case of Mahomes, though, it was pure fantasy football bliss. But the question remains, can Mahomes maintain this level of production moving forward? Fantasy managers are hoping that Week 7 was just the beginning of a sustained stretch of dominance from the Kansas City star. The truth is that Mahomes' performance this season could be one of the biggest factors in fantasy football playoff races, as his owners know all too well. His ability to deliver massive performances in any given week makes him a cornerstone player in fantasy football. For the rest of the season, Mahomes will remain one of the most sought-after players in fantasy football. His ability to produce big points week in and week out, combined with the favorable matchups ahead, means that fantasy managers should expect even more stellar performances in the weeks to come. And for those managers who took a risk and drafted him early in the season, the payoff from Week 7 is just the beginning of what could be a monster second half of the season. As we head into Week 8 and beyond, fantasy football managers will need to stay sharp. The league is full of surprises, and even a player as talented as Mahomes isn't immune to a rough stretch. But after Week 7, it's clear that Mahomes' fantasy football glory is far from over. For those lucky enough to have him on their roster, it's time to sit back, relax, and enjoy the ride as the second half of the NFL season kicks into high gear.